closer to victory.
I recently posted a community poll asking if the MiG-23 MLD was too good. The results were rather surprising. From seeing the in-game chat on War Thunder, I would have expected the vast majority of votes would have been yes, it's too good. Refreshingly, this was not the case, as all three options, yes, no, and undecided, ended up all being within the 30% range, nearly a perfect 1/3 split. But ever since the outcry of the MiG-23 MLD, I got around to thinking, what is it that could make the MiG-23 MLD too good? Let's get into some of the attributes of the MLD and see if we can't come to an informed opinion. It can carry a total of 6 missiles, with no matter what loadout you carry, only 2 of them being R-24s, E or T models. To complement its missiles, the MLD also features a more advanced radar system than we see on previous Russian 11.0s. The MLD's radar has access to the same modes as the previous MiG-23M, being MTI, which you can just think of as watered-down pulse Doppler of other aircraft like the EJ Kai, the Viggen, the FGR-2, things like that. It's also got LD mode, which I'm going to assume stands for look down, because that is in fact what LD mode does. But it is not to be confused with pulse Doppler abilities. It is the same as the default radar mode, just with the radar searching down instead of an equal number of degrees up and down. It can be useful at times, but I found that it doesn't really reliably get strong locks, though it can oftentimes paint targets on the radar for you to see. MTI and LD will switch between each other as a selectable mode based on your altitude. At really low altitudes it'll be MTI, and then once you pass the maximum altitude MTI allows, then it'll switch to LD. The MLD does have a new mode that no other Russian aircraft has had before it, ACM. While technically you could say the 23M has ACM, it's really just a gunsight radar that doesn't actually move or scan. The MLD, however, is the type of ACM you and I think of traditionally that scans a particular area in front of the nose. This is a big deal to me, as I'm more often than not using ACM to get radar locks on my 11.0 jets just for the sake of speed and simplicity. The MLD also gets IRST, which will function the same as we've been used to with the MiG-23M. I find IRST to be rather finicky though at times, and certainly switches locks unrealistically easy when two aircraft cross, similar to that we see on radar. I think all IR equipment in general, including missiles, should be less sensitive than they are now, but overall IRST is a helpful tool. When using it, you'll be able to have a greater window of launch time when locking IRST with any of the missiles that are compatible with it, given that you don't have to first bore sight and then give the missile lead. Instead, IRST will keep your seeker locked onto what it is you want to fire at, whether you point the seeker there or not. It's essentially the same thing as radar slaving your missile, without the limitations of radar such as altitude or chaff. Performance-wise, the MiG-23 MLD is indisputably the best 11.0 aircraft. That is, if you know exactly what you have to do and at what times. Being that the MiG-23 is a swing-wing aircraft, you're going to want different wing sweeps for different speeds you're fighting at. If your speed is constantly fluctuating, you'd think maybe putting the wings into automatic mode would be a good idea so that you don't have to worry about it. But you'd be very wrong. The MLD's maneuverability when in automatic mode is not bad by any means, but certainly nothing to write home about. It's going to try to give you a good mix of maneuverability and speed performance, but not giving you anything spectacular out of either. The wings only come all the way forward at very, very low speeds and only sweep all the way back at supersonic speeds. Until you get to either ends of those extremes, your MiG-23 will be mediocre at best. This is why it's best to use manual wing sweep to control for most situations. If you plan on dogfighting somebody, just throw the wings all the way forward from the start. If you plan on going fast, just sweep them all the way back from the start. There are of course times where it isn't necessary and maybe even beneficial not to do so, but as a rule of thumb, get used to changing your wing sweep by yourself to get the most out of your maneuverability and your acceleration. Engine wise, the MLD is very solid. particularly at high speeds. The MLD is amongst, if not the fastest accelerating planes past supersonic speeds. Not only that, but it is also the fastest plane on the deck, being able to redline at Mach 1.15, yet not rip until Mach 1.2 at sea level. This is of course dependent on the map, so take those numbers with a grain of salt. You may find yourself able to go faster or rip sooner. Regardless of what map though, the MLD is going to be the fastest plane on the deck either way. In many cases, not by much, but for whatever it's worth, you can say you're the fastest. While I don't recommend anybody get into sustained dogfights at 11.0, it is reassuring to be in an aircraft that is good in them if you do find yourself turning and burning. When faced with a pilot of equal skill, the MiG-23 MLD will win a dogfight against anything at top tier. Not only is it the best rate fighter at 11.0, but it is also superior to almost everything in one circle fights on most speeds as well. I've been able to pull 15G turns in the MLD. Even if you don't find yourself winning the one circle, you can always continue dodging the nose position, transition to a rate fight once they've bled their energy, and continue from there. And so up until this point, I've painted the MLD in a rather positive light, but it pretty much goes downhill from here. Keep in mind, that is of course not to say the MLD is a bad plane. This does bring us into something the MLD is not the best in, and that is low speed acceleration. While not bad by any means, you will find yourself losing the low speed drag race against planes like the MiG-21 BIS and select Phantoms. This is something to note as an adversary of the MLD, so you might want to jot that down. If you find yourself being hunted by the MLD, give it a sharp 180-degree turn and fly away toward your team or just to get some distance. If the MiG follows your sharp turn, he will likely be temporarily slower than you until you get back up to supersonic speeds. One of my least favorite attributes of this aircraft is the roll rate. It doesn't sound like a very big issue, but once we get into the real shortcomings of the MLD, this is just another thing that will snowball onto more important things later. The MLD doesn't like to roll. On full wing sweep, its roll rate is actually pretty good. If you're on high speeds though, which is when you'd have full wing sweep, you likely don't really need it to roll very well in the first place. On just about every other wing position, the MLD's roll rate is mediocre at best or bad at worst. This is especially the case on the most forward position of the wings, which is the most problematic because this is likely when you need it most: low speed dogfighting. Keeping the roll rate in mind, a very overlooked utility of 11.0 is the gun. If you've been following my channel, you know that I harp on the fact that the Vulcan is one of the most useful tools to have at 11.0, and aircraft that don't have it are gravely missing out. While some aircraft at least have adequate guns for top tier, the Russians continue to really suffer in this aspect. Before I trigger die-hard Russian players that firmly stand by their MiGs, let me just say that of course gun kills are possible with the GSH-23L. I don't doubt that you've hit some pretty nutty shots with it, as have I. But the reality is the Vulcan is simply easier to learn, takes less time to master, and as I said with the two pilots dogfighting with equal skill, two pilots of equal skill using the GSH-23 or the Vulcan user is always going to have more success. Most of your gun kills at top tier come from high speed, high aspect, one burst passes. There are other ways gun kills happen, but this is the safest as you're not going to be exposing yourself to possible third party attacks on low speed. The GSH-23L's lackluster velocity is going to severely hinder your ability to score gun kills. With great practice, it can be done, but you'd see the same result with an eighth of the practice time on the Vulcan than you will with the 23mm. The 23mm recently got a damage buff, but it was roughly 10% if memory serves me well, and you'll still find yourself rarely scoring one burst kills outside of rear aspect shots, as they're much easier to get a large mass of rounds on target. Most guns suffer from the same problem, but the Vulcan's fire rate allows for a storm of 20mm to impact the target regardless of the aspect. As a result, you'll likely find yourself dealing less damage than you would with your Vulcan counterparts. So remember when I said the roll rate was mainly an issue due to the snowballing effects of other bigger issues? Well, take the poor low speed roll rate of the MLD and combine it with a gun that has the muzzle velocity of an ATGM, and you have a very tricky combination to score a gun kill at all. For more experienced MiG-23 pilots, this is something that can be overcome, but for the average player, it will be a frustrating struggle. The MLD is also very unresponsive to mouse inputs for minor flight corrections. For example, if you've rolled onto your side and you want to adjust your gun just a hair vertically, your rudder through mouse input will barely function at all. As you will see with one of these clips, I'm not sure which one it is, but I'll likely add a caption on screen to indicate when. Moving on to my least favorite part of the MLD, the loadout. I know that sentence just made the MiG fans and NATO victims bleed out of their ears, so allow me to elaborate. With the update groundbreaking, flares got a huge buff. There is not a single missile in the game that cannot be defeated by a single flare drop. I have personally showed 5 random players in custom battles demonstrations of all of them, all of which had changed their mind about whatever falsity they had believed before, such as, and I quote, AIM-9Js being immune to flares. Some missiles have it worse than others, such as IRSTs, but the difference is so negligible anymore it doesn't really matter what you fire. That being said, there are 2 ways to think about choosing your shorter range IR missiles. Number 1, no matter what I launch, it'll get 1 flared anyways. The only way to score a kill is if they don't see it coming, so I'll use the longest range missiles I have access to, as it's easier to be stealthy, especially if my missile has good flight time after the motor and indicator turn off. This holds true for missiles like the R-13M1. And then we have number 2, which is no matter what I launch, it'll get 1 flared anyway. The only way to score kills is to launch at very close ranges / unpredictable aspects to decrease the chance they'll be able to flare it in time, so I'll pick the best short range missile available. This holds true for missiles like the R-60s. Either way of thinking has substance to it, and both are viable tactics to consider when choosing your loadouts at top tier. I personally don't believe the current flare meta is what we're going to have for very long, as I think it very obviously decreases skill at top tier and subtracts from the goal of modern jet fighters. By the time you're watching this video, it is entirely possible there's zero reason to use the R-60s again, but anyway, that is again a topic for a later video. So how does all of this tie into the loadout being my least favorite part of the MLD? Get to the point. Okay. Well, now that we've established the 2 reasonings for choosing our IR missiles, it is very clear that both options have one thing in common. If something sees your IR missile fired at them, kiss your chances goodbye of scoring a kill. Skillful or not, this is the reality of current 11.0. Now we see a very big reliance on long-range missiles, particularly Fox 1s in the form of R-24Rs or Ts, AIM-72s, and Skyflash missiles to skillfully and reliably fight enemies with consistent results. When looking at the R-24s the MLD has access to, it only has 2. Both the R and the T have the same flight characteristics and are in fact inferior to Skyflash and AIM-72 missiles. Here is why. Inferior may be a strong word, so let me just state that the R-24 and Skyflash are very comparably and mostly equally capable missiles. Given the fact that they're mostly equal, all it takes is for one to be slightly worse than the other at anything really, for it to count as technically inferior. This is and isn't the case for the R-24, but more so leans on the side of is. The Skyflash pulls harder than the R-24 by 1G. In many cases, however, it will feel like significantly more because the Skyflash starts tracking off the rail significantly faster than the R-24. Think of R-60s tracking off the rail as the Skyflash and AIM-9Js tracking off of the rail as the R-24. This allows you to launch the Skyflash in more scenarios than the R-24 and have a larger margin of error. This is especially noticeable at closer ranges, such as inside 2 to 3 kilometers. While technically the R-24 is supposed to have more range than the Skyflash, it isn't significant enough to matter. Even in a head-on, high-closure launch, firing either missile past say 8 to 10 kilometers is very defendable for the target and likely isn't going to hit regardless, if they're a competent player. Yet both missiles have zero trouble getting to those ranges. Hitting a target, not so much. It's when you put actual combat into practice does the stat card of a missile become kind of foggy. As we've already covered, the MiG-23 MLD has coveted flight performance. In many areas, the best at 11.0. I used the comparison of the F4E to the MiG-21 BIS when the BIS released in my last video, and some people saw that as unfair, and I entirely disagree. I'll cover this briefly as I plan on giving it its own video, but the F4E always had and always will have killing potential over the MiG-21 BIS. Despite the BIS having such superior flight performance over everything at the time, it was the fact that it had a very bad gun, had no viable Fox 1 missiles, a terrible radar, very easily flared Fox 2 missiles, and significantly less flares than the F4E, i.e. lack of killing potential, that kept it balanced and kept me from jumping on the bandwagon that it was overpowered, or even the best jet in the game. I had always left that to debate, as the F4E and the 21 BIS were the two undisputable kings at the time. There really wasn't much competition elsewhere. We are now in a much different War Thunder, where the weaknesses of having low killing potential are even further exemplified through flares, and the reliance of Fox 1s and good radars is becoming more and more important. Flight performance isn't everything. It's important to not overlook that statement. Look at the Lightning F6 for example. When in the right hands, untouchable at the battle rating, but that does not mean that the Lightning can kill everything that it wants at will. In many cases, it's actually the complete opposite. You'll often find yourself getting your 2 R24 kills in your MLD and doing absolutely nothing else of importance for the rest of the entire match. By no means though, through lack of trying. We're long past the days where raw performance dictates the usefulness of an aircraft, and this directly applies to the MLD. With all of that being said, I am by no means an MLD hater. I think it fits into the game perfectly, and I'm taking time to point out the drawbacks of the plane in fear that the community is going to complain so much that it gets nerfed into obsolescence, similar to the MiG-23 BIS that we have today. It's good that Russia finally has something that is at least in the conversation of the best plane in the game, and that's not a bad thing. I'm also in agreement that the US could use a new Phantom similar in performance to things like the FGR-2 and the EJ Kai, and I fully expect the J/S Phantom to be the next plane added to the US tech tree. The US is by no means a top 3 contender for best aircraft anymore. I'm not claiming that, and I never was. But you have to understand that every country in War Thunder goes through this phase at some point, and that's still not to say that the F4E is a useless plane, because it isn't. Things have to be slowly added for the sake of balancing. Yes, the F-14A came out before the MLD, but adding that into the game would be an absolute slaughter for everything that has the misfortune of going against it, unless of course it came with severely watered down weaponry. All in all, I think the MLD is fine as it is. If anything, it's possible that it has too much power at supersonic speeds, but it's not the biggest issue. I don't find a distinguished winner as the best jet for 11.0 when looking at the FGR-2, the EJ Kai, the Viggen, or the MLD, especially not in the current flare meta, and I don't think that's how it should be. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the MLD, and I hope you learned something about it that you'll be able to take against it, but most importantly, I hope I'll see you on the next video. See ya.